The jungle was supposed to break them. Days without food, nights without sleep, blistered feet trudging through mud that smelled of rot. For most, the final trial was already too much. For her, it was something worse. They had caught them. Not real enemies, but instructors playing the role with cruel precision. Black bags thrown over their heads, wrists bound behind their backs, dragged across the jungle floor until their uniforms were soaked in blood and sweat. They were lined up under a crude wooden shelter, knees pressed into the dirt, the heat suffocating, the insects biting without mercy. And then he came, the commanding officer who had hated her from the moment she applied, the one who said, "Women don't belong here, not in special forces, not ever." He circled like a predator, boots crunching in the mud, barking at the others to stay awake or die. And then, like he had been waiting for this moment all along, he stopped in front of her. "Let's see what happens when enemy forces catch a female combatant," he said coldly. The other recruits kept their eyes down. No one dared move. He yanked her upright by the collar, ripping mud-soaked fabric, sneering as he forced her against the post. His words cut through the night like a blade. "Out here, you're not a soldier. You're prey." His hand pressed against her chest. His voice lowered, cruel and deliberate. "And I'm going to show them what enemies do when they capture one of you." The others froze. They had been beaten, starved, dragged through hell, but this wasn't training anymore. This was humiliation. This was destruction. And she was alone. Bound, bruised, trembling, with the weight of the entire jungle pressing down on her chest. She felt the moment stretch into eternity. The men who mocked her, the officers who doubted her, the world that laughed at the very idea of a woman making it this far, all of them were right here, watching, waiting for her to break. She closed her eyes, and for a second, it looked like she finally would.
Long before the jungle, long before the bruises and the mud and the suffocating silence of humiliation, it began with a single sheet of paper. An application. At the top, United States Army Special Forces Selection Program. For most recruits, it was a moment of pride. For her, it was a moment of defiance. The office where she dropped off the form was lined with photos of men. Men in berets, men with medals, men standing proudly in groups with faces chiseled by war and years of training. Not one woman stared back from those walls. The sergeant at the desk barely looked up when she slid the application across to him. He just glanced at the form, saw the name, and then the gender marker, female, and actually chuckled. "You lost?" he asked flatly. She said nothing, just stared back, jaw tight, waiting for the stamp. The sound of the stamp echoed in the empty hallway, but the smirk on the sergeant's face said more than words ever could. She won't last a week. When word spread, it was worse. In the barracks, men whispered, laughed, even placed bets on how quickly she would drop out. Some said 3 days. Some said 1. A few said she wouldn't survive the bus ride to camp. One soldier slapped another $5 bill into a jar and sneered, 2 days, tops. Her arms will give out before her boots even break in. It wasn't just the recruits. Officers rolled their eyes. Commanders scoffed. Even a few higher-ups muttered that this was a publicity stunt, that some pencil pusher upstairs wanted to make a point. And then there was him, the commanding officer. From the moment her file landed on his desk, he made his feelings clear. He tapped the application with the back of his pen, snorted, and said to his staff, "This is a circus, and I'll make sure she knows it." At home, things weren't easier. Her father had served, and though he didn't mock her, he didn't support her either. He stared at the form one night over dinner and said carefully, "You don't have to prove anything, you know? There are other ways to serve. Safer ways. Smarter ways." Her mother went further. This isn't just dangerous, it's pointless. They don't want you there. They'll chew you up just to prove a point." She ate in silence. Every word they said was true, but truth and permission were not the same thing. Later that night, as she laced up her boots and packed her small bag, her mother appeared in the doorway. Not angry now, just afraid. "Why?" she whispered. "Why put yourself through this?" She zipped the bag shut and said the only thing that ever made sense to her. "Because they said I couldn't." The bus ride to the training site was long, silent, heavy with nerves and sweat. Dozens of men packed in, their shaved heads bobbing with the rhythm of the road. She sat near the back, alone. The air smelled of leather and dust, and under it all, the stink of doubt. Some recruits stared openly. Others pretended not to, but their whispers carried anyway. "Dead weight. She'll slow us down. Probably can't even do a pull-up." Every mile the bus rolled forward felt like another stone added to her pack. Not one of them thought she belonged here. And yet she did. She belonged simply because she had chosen to belong. When they arrived at the gates, the real introduction began. The instructors didn't shake hands, they barked orders. They didn't welcome the recruits, they broke them down. "Get off my bus!" one roared. And within seconds, men stumbled onto the dirt, already flustered, already sweating. She stepped off last. The commanding officer was waiting, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the harsh sun. He looked her up and down slowly, then turned to the group. "Gentlemen!" And he let the pause hang just long enough to sting. "Guest." Laughter rippled through the ranks. She didn't flinch. He leaned closer, voice low but venomous. "You won't last, soldier, and I'll make sure of it." Orientation was brutal. Not physically, not yet, but psychologically. They were shown failure rates, photos of soldiers carried out on stretchers, names of those who hadn't made it. The attrition rate hovered like a death sentence. 80% don't finish. She stared at the number, unblinking. The odds weren't against her, they were against everyone. But no one else had a target painted on their back like she did. The first night in the barracks, she found her bunk stripped. No sheets, no blanket, no pillow, just a bare frame. A note lay on the mattress. "Go home." She picked it up, crumpled it, and dropped it into the trash. Later, she heard whispers and muffled laughter. They expected her to quit before morning. But as the lights went out and the room filled with the snores and groans of exhausted men, she lay on the bare frame, staring at the ceiling, heart hammering. Every muscle in her body told her to walk out, to admit defeat before the real pain began. But she didn't move, because walking out would mean they were right. And she hadn't come here to prove them right. She had come here to prove them wrong. The next morning, when reveille blared and boots slammed onto the floor, she was already standing, uniform pressed, boots laced, eyes set like stone. One recruit muttered under his breath, "Still here?" She looked straight ahead, jaw clenched, and whispered to herself, "Still here." And for the first time, she smiled, because survival was victory. And this was only the beginning.
The first morning wasn't about warming up. It was about breaking. The recruits lined up on the parade ground just as the sun tore over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. The air smelled of dust and sweat already. She stood among them, boots pressed into gravel, the weight of dozens of stairs burning into her back. The commanding officer walked down the line slowly, like a butcher choosing which carcass to cut first. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but not his contempt. When he stopped in front of her, he didn't say her name. He didn't even say, "Soldier." He simply said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Dead weight." Laughter rippled again. It was becoming a chorus. "Drop!" barked another instructor. Every recruit hit the dirt, push-ups. The cadence was merciless. 1, 2, 3, 4. The heat from the ground pressed into her palms. Dust filled her throat. She kept her eyes forward, locked on the dirt, refusing to glance sideways. By 50, men were already sagging. By 70, some collapsed entirely. By 90, the air was filled with groans and curses. At 100, the instructor screamed, "On your feet! Run!" And just like that, they were off. The obstacle course wasn't built for success. It was built to destroy. Walls taller than men, rope climbs that shredded palms, crawls under barbed wire while machine guns rattled overhead with blanks. The mud was thick, the sun unrelenting, and the instructors merciless. She hit the first wall and slipped. Mud coated her boots, her gloves, her chest. A man behind her sneered, "Move, princess!" He shoved past, vaulting over. She tried again, legs trembling, arms screaming. She clawed her way up, fingers digging into splintered wood. At the top, for a split second, she saw the whole field. Men dropping like flies, some limping, others gasping for air. And then she hurled herself over, crashing into the mud on the other side. No applause, no relief, just another command. Move. She moved. The rope climb was worse. Her arms burned before she was even halfway. Below, the instructor shouted, "Ring the bell if you're done. Go home if you're done." A few men let go, ringing out, sliding down, defeated. She gritted her teeth, every inch a war. Sweat blinded her, rope burned her hands raw. The voices below grew louder, mocking, waiting for her to quit. "Slip, sweetheart. Bell's right there. Go home." Her grip faltered, her vision blurred. For a terrifying moment, she thought she would fall. And then something inside her snapped. Not a bone, not a muscle, but something deeper. A voice, her own, cutting through the noise. Not yet. She pulled. One more handhold, then another. By the time she slapped the top, her arms shook violently, but she hadn't quit. The silence below wasn't respect. It was shock. The crawl came next. Barbed wire stretched low, so low, their backs nearly tore against it. Mud seeped into their mouths. Instructor screamed, "Faster! You're dead already! Move!" Machine gun fire cracked above. Men panicked, scraping elbows raw, choking on mud. Someone cried out, a wire ripping flesh. She pushed forward. The mud pressed into her eyes, her nose, her teeth. She kept going, crawling, dragging, pulling herself forward inch by inch. At one point, her uniform snagged. Wire bit into her back. She was stuck. For a split second, she thought, "This is it. I'm trapped. I can't." But she didn't stop. She exhaled slowly, flattened herself lower, and wriggled until the wire tore fabric but released her skin. She pushed through. When she finally rolled out on the other side, face caked in mud, lungs burning, the instructor crouched in front of her, smirking. "Still here?" he said. She spat mud to the side and met his stare without blinking. "Still here." The final test was the run. 6 miles, full pack, no mercy. They lined up again, some barely standing, uniforms dripping with sweat and mud. The commanding officer paced in front of them, smiling like a wolf. "Most of you won't make it. That's fine. You're not meant to. This isn't for everyone. This is for the elite. And if you can't keep up, you don't deserve the uniform." His eyes slid to her. He didn't smile this time. He didn't laugh. He just shook his head slowly, like she was already a corpse. "Move." The pack dug into her shoulders like knives. Every step was agony. Her legs screamed. The heat pressed into her skull until she thought her brain might boil. Men began to drop. One fell face first into the dirt, unconscious. Another stumbled to the side, vomiting. The medics carried them off,
one by one. She staggered, but didn't stop. Her breaths came in ragged bursts. Her vision narrowed. At mile 4, she thought she would die. Her chest locked. Her legs went numb. The pack seemed to double in weight. She whispered to herself between gasps, "Not yet, not yet, not yet." At mile 5, she passed 2 men who had mocked her on the bus. They lay on the side of the trail, begging for water. Neither looked at her. At mile 6, she crossed the line. Not first, not last, but standing. The commanding officer watched from the shade. His arms were still crossed, his sunglasses hiding his eyes. But for the first time, he didn't call her dead weight. He didn't call her anything at all. Because silence in that moment said more than words ever could. That night in the barracks, she collapsed on her bunk, body broken, arms bleeding, hands blistered raw. Around her, men groaned, cursed, and some packed their bags quietly in the dark, too ashamed to stay. She lay on her thin mattress, staring at the ceiling again, every muscle screaming for relief. And though her body begged her to quit, her mind whispered the same 2 words it always had, "Still here." And for the first time, she believed she might actually stay.
The pool smelled of chlorine and fear. It was supposed to be a training exercise, but everyone knew the truth. This was a culling ground. The recruits lined up at the edge, eyes fixed on the water below. Some shifted nervously, hands twitching at their sides. Others stood stiff, pretending not to care. And some, like her, simply locked their jaws and waited. The instructors barked the rules in clipped tones. Hands tied behind backs, feet bound. Drop in, survive. They called it drown-proofing. Most called it torture. One by one, recruits shuffled forward. A rope cinched their wrists, another looped around their ankles. Some dropped in like stones, thrashing violently until poles hooked them out, coughing and retching. Others found a rhythm, kicking just enough, floating on their backs, controlling panic with clenched jaws and closed eyes. Failure rates were high. Instructors expected them to be. When her turn came, the air seemed to thicken. Every eye turned, every whisper sharpened. She stepped forward, boots squeaking on the wet tile. The commanding officer stood with arms crossed, his sunglasses reflecting the rippling blue surface. His voice cut across the room. "Watch closely, gentlemen. This is what happens when fantasy meets reality." Behind her, the chuckles started, one louder than the rest. "Bet she doesn't last 30 seconds, a voice said. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. Stafford. Tall, broad-shouldered, a natural athlete already standing out in every drill. He had mocked her from the bus ride on, never letting a moment pass without a sneer. To him, she was an insult, proof that standards had slipped, that the program was being cheapened. Now he leaned against the railing, smirking. "Go ahead," he called, loud enough for the others to hear. "Show us what equality looks like." The instructor's whistle cut through the tension. No more stalling. She dropped in. The shock was instant. Freezing water punched the air from her lungs. Bound hands and feet dragged her under like anchors. Her chest seized. Panic flared white-hot in her skull. Kick. Twist. Rise. She fought for air, bubbles rushing past her cheeks. The blue ceiling of water seeming impossibly far away. Her head broke the surface for a gasp, only for a long wooden pole to shove her back down. "No cheating!" the instructor roared. "Stay under, stay calm, stay alive!" Water closed over her head again, muffling the world into silence. The pool bottom rushed toward her. The ropes dug into her ankles. Her chest screamed for oxygen. Don't thrash, don't panic. But instinct betrayed her. She flailed, kicked, coughed out precious air. Her body screamed, "Breathe," even though breathing meant death. She forced herself still, steady, just long enough to drift upward again. Her mouth broke the surface. She stole a desperate gulp. Another pole shoved her back down. She sank. Again. Minutes stretched like hours. Up. Gasp. Down. Sink. Over and over the cycle repeated. Each time her lungs burned hotter. Each time panic clawed closer to the surface. She coughed, swallowed water, gagged. The blur of recruits above sharpened into shapes, men pointing, laughing, miming drowning motions with their hands. Stafford's grin was the clearest of all. "She's done," he muttered. "Get her out before she embarrasses herself." Her chest locked tight, her vision narrowed into tunnels of light and shadow. Darkness crept in at the edges. She wanted to quit, to scream, to claw her way up and ring out. But through the haze, something rose. Not an instructor's command, not a recruit's mockery, but her own voice, quiet, steady, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Not yet. Her kick slowed, her mind stilled, she fell into rhythm. Down, up, gasp, down again. She stopped fighting the water and started moving with it. Her body ached, but her will held. The seconds stacked, the minutes dragged, and then the whistle. Hands grabbed her shoulders, hauling her up. She collapsed on the wet tile, coughing violently, water streaming from her nose and mouth. Her chest convulsed with ragged breaths. She curled, clutching at the slick floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. But she was alive. She had made it. The commanding officer crouched near her, his shadow falling across her face. He shook his head slowly, like a disappointed parent. "Pathetic," he spat. "Barely survived. That wasn't strength, that was luck, and luck runs out." Laughter roared across the pool deck. Stafford's voice led it, sharp and cutting. "Next time we'll get you some floaties, princess." She coughed again, spit water to the side, and forced her eyes up. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just whispered, lips cracked, throat raw, "Still here." The words weren't for him. They weren't for them. They were for herself. That night in the barracks, she expected silence. Instead, Stafford made sure there wasn't any. He leaned against her bunk, arms crossed, grin smug. "You think flailing in a pool makes you tough? You think making it through that circus proves anything?" She sat up slowly, body aching, eyes steady. "You're dragging us down," he went on. "You'll never pass the real tests. You're just wasting everyone's time." She swallowed hard, chest still sore, and spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "I'm still here." He laughed, shook his head, walked away. But something flickered in his eyes, something small, almost hidden. Unease. Because deep down he knew what he had just watched. She had drowned in front of him and somehow come back breathing. And that wasn't luck. It was something else. Something he didn't yet understand. The next morning, numbers appeared on the chalkboard in the mess hall. Failures. Dropouts. 3 men gone. Stronger, faster, louder. Her number wasn't on the list. She was still here. And when she walked past Stafford this time, he didn't laugh, he didn't smile, he just stared. The ruck sat on the ground like an anvil, waiting for a back to break. 60 pounds of gear, food, water, ammunition. Dead weight stuffed into a green canvas pack that looked ordinary enough, until you tried to carry it mile after mile under a sun that baked the earth and scorched the lungs. The instructors called it the March. The recruits called it something else. The Killer. She stared at the pack, adjusting the straps across her shoulders. Her boots were already scarred from training, her hands raw from ropes, her arms aching from push-ups and water drills. Every part of her body screamed against the idea of adding another 60 pounds to the pain. But there was no choice. One by one, the men slung their rucks onto their backs with grunts. Stafford did it in one fluid motion, smirking when he saw her struggle to lift hers from the dirt. "Need a hand, princess?" he drawled. His buddies snickered. She ignored him, bent her knees.
heaved the pack up until the straps dug into her shoulders like knives. The weight nearly pulled her backward. Her legs trembled under it. But she was upright. The whistle blew. They moved. The trail was dust and heat and misery. Boots thudded in rhythm, packs squeaked against sweat-soaked uniforms. Breaths came in ragged bursts. The sun climbed higher, pressing its weight down on them until even the air seemed heavy. By the second mile, sweat poured into eyes, stung wounds pooled at the base of their spines. Some men cursed, some sang cadences to distract themselves. By the fourth, silence fell. No one wasted breath anymore. Her pack carved into her shoulders, grinding bones raw. Her thighs burned, her calves screamed. Every step was a negotiation between collapse and stubbornness. Stafford strode a few paces ahead, pack swaying but steady. He looked back once, just long enough to throw her a grin. "Try not to slow us down." She clenched her jaw, kept moving. The instructors didn't march, they stalked. Jeep engines rumbled beside the trail, carrying officers who barked insults through bullhorns. "You call that walking? My grandmother moves faster. Fall behind and you're out. Ring the bell if you're tired of embarrassing yourselves." The commanding officer's voice rose above them all, cruel and sharp. "You, dead weight. How long before that rut crushes you? A mile? 2? She didn't look at him, didn't give him the satisfaction. She just fixed her eyes on Stafford's boots ahead of her and forced her own to follow. By the 7th mile, the march turned brutal. The trail narrowed into swamp. Mud sucked at boots, pulling like quicksand. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, biting through uniforms, buzzing in ears until sanity frayed. Men cursed, swatted, stumbled. One recruit slipped, his pack dragging him face first into the muck. He flailed, gagging, before an instructor pulled him out and stripped his number. Gone. She pushed forward, legs sinking shin deep, every step a war against the swamp. Her boots filled with water. Blisters burst. Her shoulders bled where the straps dug into skin. Stafford laughed when he saw her struggle, his teeth flashing as he pushed ahead. "Face it, this isn't for you." For a moment, she wanted to collapse, to let the mud swallow her whole. But the voice inside her came again, steady, relentless, still here. She gritted her teeth and dragged one boot free, then the other, then the next. Step, step, step. By mile 10, men began to fall out. Some dropped to their knees, packs crushing them into the dirt. Others stumbled sideways into the swamp, begging for medics. The Jeep engines revved, hauling the broken away like carcasses from a battlefield. The instructors didn't slow down. They didn't look back. "Leave the weak behind!" one shouted. "Only the strong move forward." She kept moving. Her vision blurred, her lips cracked, salt burned her eyes, her pack felt like a coffin strapped to her shoulders. And then suddenly, Stafford stumbled. It was small, a trip on a route, a hitch in his stride, but she saw it. The man who mocked her, who never stopped sneering, had faltered. His face tightened as he forced his pace back up, glancing over his shoulder to see if anyone noticed. Their eyes met. He scowled. She said nothing. But in that fleeting look, something shifted. For the first time, Stafford had seen her not as dead weight, but as witness. And witnesses made weakness dangerous. By the 15th mile, her legs were lead. The swamp gave way to a rocky incline, a hill that seemed to scrape the sky. Men groaned when they saw it. Some cursed.
Some simply sat down at the base and tore their packs off. Done! She didn't stop. She adjusted the straps, winced as blood ran down her back from torn skin, and began to climb. Every step was agony. Her knees shook, her lungs burned, her heartbeat roared in her ears. Stafford pushed ahead, grimacing, sweat streaming. He wasn't mocking now. He wasn't laughing. He was fighting his own battle. Halfway up, a recruit beside her dropped. His body crumbled, his ruck pinning him into the dirt. Medics rushed in. Another gone. She didn't even look. Couldn't afford to. One more step. And another. And another. By the time she reached the crest, her body was broken. She staggered, collapsed to her knees, gasping. The view blurred through tears and sweat, but she was up there, still standing. At the checkpoint, the instructors counted heads. Dozens had started. Fewer than half remained. The commanding officer stalked the survivors, sunglasses hiding his eyes but not his disdain. He stopped in front of her, his shadow falling across her body as she tried to steady her breathing. Not bad for dead weight. It was the closest thing to praise he would ever give. Stafford stood a few feet away, wiping sweat from his brow. His smirk was gone. His grin had evaporated. He didn't look at her this time. He just stared at the ground, jaw tight. Silent. And silence from Stafford was louder than any insult. That night in the barracks, she peeled her boots off and winced at the blisters that covered her feet. The smell of sweat and blood filled the room. Men groaned in their bunks, some packing their bags quietly, ashamed to leave. She lay on her thin mattress, body screaming, mind barely hanging on. But before sleep claimed her, she whispered the words again, the only mantra that mattered. Still here. And for the first time she realized each day, each march, each humiliation, the list of those still here grew shorter. And she was always on it.
They thought the marches and drown-proofing were bad. They hadn't seen anything yet. Because if the swamp and the miles had broken bodies, this was the week meant to break minds. The rules were simple. No sleep, no food, no comfort. Only drills. Only orders. Only chaos. By the end of it, most recruits didn't know what day it was. Some didn't even know their own names. It started with the siren, blaring at 2 a.m, dragging every soldier out of bed, boots barely laced, uniforms half-buttoned. They were herded outside into the freezing dark. "Ambush!" the instructor shouted, voices cracking like rifle fire. "Grab your gear! Move!" They stumbled, disoriented, packs slamming onto aching shoulders. She fumbled with her straps, vision still foggy from the 2 hours of sleep they had been allowed. Stafford was already ahead, barking at others to keep up. He still had energy, but even he looked different now. Not smug, just tense. They ran through the trees, branches whipping faces, boots hammering roots and rocks. Instructors fired blanks into the night, the cracks echoing like thunder. Someone tripped, someone else cursed. The shouting never stopped. "You're dead! You hesitated! You're dead! Faster! Faster! Faster!" Her lungs burned, her legs shook, but she kept moving. Not because she was faster, but because stopping wasn't an option. By dawn, they were crawling through mud again, not under barbed wire this time, but under nets soaked with water. The cold cut into their bones. The mud coated their faces until they could barely see. She felt herself slowing. Every cell screamed to stop. The pack felt like stone. And then came the voice. "Move it, deadweight!" The commanding officer stood above her, yelling so close she could feel the spit on her face. "This is where you quit, isn't it? This is where you prove me right." She gritted her teeth, lowered her head, and dragged herself forward, inch by inch, mud filling her mouth, rocks tearing her elbows.
When she finally pulled free, Stafford was waiting. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't laughing, but he still couldn't resist a jab. "You're slowing us down," he muttered, breathless, before staggering ahead. By the second night, hallucinations began. Some recruits swear they saw lights in the trees. Others talk to people who weren't there. One broke down entirely, crying for his mother until medics carried him away. She wasn't immune. At one point, she saw her childhood bedroom, clear as day, posters on the wall, the window cracked open, her father sitting in the corner saying softly, "You don't have to prove anything." She shook her head violently, forcing the vision away. But when she blinked, the image was still there. She wanted to collapse into it, wanted to believe she was home, warm, safe. But the voice inside her whispered again, "Still here." She blinked hard. The room dissolved. The jungle returned, and she kept walking. By the third night, Stafford cracked. Not all the way, not enough to quit, but enough to show the strain. They were on guard duty, rotating shifts that left no one with more than 15 minutes of rest at a time. She caught him slumping against his rifle, eyes fluttering shut. "Stay awake!" an instructor barked. "You fall asleep, your whole squad dies!" Stafford jolted upright, face flushed, shame burning across his cheeks. His eyes flicked toward her, daring her to laugh, to sneer back. But she didn't. She just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if she hadn't seen anything at all. For the first time, Stafford said nothing. The drills grew stranger. They were blindfolded and forced to assemble weapons by touch. They were made to carry logs for miles without a word. They were ordered to hold freezing planks for hours, collapsing one by one until only a handful remained. At every stage, instructors circled like vultures, shouting, humiliating, waiting for weakness. The commanding officer was the worst. He targeted her relentlessly. "You're breaking. I can see it in your eyes. You don't belong here, and you never will. You think this proves anything? You're a joke." She wanted to scream back, wanted to let the rage spill out. But rage took energy she couldn't spare. So instead, she lowered her head, breathed, endured. By the fifth day, she was barely human. Her uniform clung to her in tatters. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes burned red from sleepless nights. But she was still standing. When they stumbled back to camp, Stafford dropped onto his bunk like a corpse. Others collapsed on the floor, boots still on. She sat on her mattress, too tired even to lay down, swaying with exhaustion. Across the room, Stafford stared at her, not mocking, not grinning, just staring. Finally, he said quietly, almost to himself, "Still here." She didn't answer. She just let her eyes close for the first time in days, knowing he was right.
The sun was merciless that morning. It wasn't just heat anymore. It was punishment. The kind that baked through skin, scorched lungs, and turned even the strongest men into shadows of themselves. They had been told it was a standard day of drills. Every recruit knew that was a lie. There was nothing standard about a week this far into selection. Standard didn't exist anymore. Only pain. The lineup was smaller now. Each morning, the crowd thinned. Men who had sworn they'd make it to the end were gone. Some were carried off on stretchers. Some rang the bell themselves. Some simply disappeared overnight, their bunks stripped bare. And yet, she was still there. Still here. The day began with sandbags. 50 pounds each, lifted above heads, dropped, lifted again. Over and over. The instructors barked counts that never seemed to end. Men groaned, veins bulged, arms trembled until they gave out. One recruit dropped his bag and screamed as his shoulder dislocated. Medics rushed in, another gone. She was trembling too. Her muscles quivered with every lift. Her vision blurred with sweat. Her lips cracked as she sucked for air. The commanding officer circled her like a shark. "Look at her," he sneered to the others. "She's seconds from breaking. Who falls first, her or you?" Some laughed weakly. Most didn't. No one had breath to waste anymore.
She clenched her jaw, lifted again, dropped, lifted again. Her arms screamed, but they obeyed. Next came the runs. Not long distances this time, but sprints, back and forth, carrying stretchers with sandbags strapped on. Your teammate's dead. Carry him or die with him. The stretchers dug into shoulders, shredded palms, crushed collarbones. Teams stumbled, collapsed, switched out. She ran with a group that didn't want her. She saw it in their eyes, the silent curse. Why her? She'll slow us down. But she didn't. When they faltered, she pushed harder. When they stumbled, she shouted at them to lift. Her voice was hoarse, cracking, but it carried. By the time the whistle blew, their stretcher hadn't dropped once. By noon, the heat was a furnace. They were ordered onto the parade ground, packs back on, rifles in hand. Drills, drills, drills. Drop, push up, sprint, crawl, drop again. The cycle blurred into madness. Men collapsed mid-movement, face first into dirt. Instructors dragged them off without a glance. Stafford was still there. Sweat poured down his face, his chest heaving, but his movements were sharp, efficient. He was built for this, and yet even he was faltering. At one point, he saw him stumble, his knees buckling. He caught himself, barely, eyes darting to see if anyone had noticed. She noticed, and for the first time, he didn't sneer when their eyes met. By evening, the parade ground was littered with the broken. The survivors stood in ragged lines, swaying, hollow-eyed, packs hanging like anchors. The commanding officer walked the line slowly, savoring the sight of near collapse. His voice dripped with venom. You think you've proven anything? You've proven you're stupid enough to stay this long. That's all. He stopped in front of her, leaned close, and whispered, just loud enough for others to hear, "Tomorrow you quit. I'll see to it." Then he moved on. That night the barracks were silent. No laughter, no whispers. Just the sound of breathing, ragged, uneven, filled with pain. She sat on her bunk, peeling blistered skin from her heels. Her hands shook as she unwrapped them, raw from ropes and sandbags. Across the room, Stafford sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Why are you still here?" She looked up. The question wasn't mocking, it wasn't sneering, it was bewildered. She considered her answer. She could have said spite, could have said pride, could have said she wanted to prove the commanding officer wrong. Instead, she just said, "Because they told me I couldn't." Stafford stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head, muttered something she didn't catch, and lay back down. But he didn't laugh. Not anymore. The next morning, the lineup was smaller again. And for the first time, when she looked around, she realized something extraordinary. There weren't many left. The men who mocked her on the bus, the ones who whispered bets about how long she'd last, the ones who shoved past her on obstacle walls and laughed when she flailed in the pool, most of them were gone. And she was still here. The instructors announced the next trial. Groans rippled through the line. Stafford cursed under his breath. She just adjusted her straps, lifted her pack, and braced for whatever came next. Because she understood something now. It wasn't about being the strongest. It wasn't about being the fastest. It was about being the last. And she had already proven one thing beyond all doubt. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not ever.
They called it the long walk. Not a march, not a run, not even a ruck, a walk. That was the joke, because the long walk was nothing less than hell stretched across days. The rules were simple. Each recruit was given a compass, a map, and coordinates. Packs fully loaded, minimal food, minimal sleep. They had to navigate alone through miles of punishing terrain. No squad, no partner, No instructor holding their hand. Just man against wilderness, or in her case, woman against wilderness. The starting line was silent that morning. The survivors stood ragged, gaunt, hollow-eyed from weeks of punishment. Their uniforms were shredded, their boots little more than stitched leather and tape. The commanding officer stood before them, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting their broken bodies. His voice was cold. "This is where most of you quit. Out there, no one cares how tough you think you are. Out there, it's just you and the silence doesn't lie." His gaze settled on her. "Some of you are already dead. You just don't know it yet." The whistle blew. They set off, one by one, disappearing into the trees. The first hours were tolerable. She adjusted her straps, checked her compass, and set a rhythm. Left, right, breathe, repeat. The forest swallowed sound. No laughter, no commands, no jeeps. Only the crunch of boots, the rustle of branches, the distant cry of birds. By nightfall, her legs throbbed. She found a patch of dirt under twisted roots, chewed a ration bar until her jaw ached, and shut her eyes for 30 minutes. No more. The whistle in her head never stopped. Move, move, move. By the second day, hunger was a living thing in her stomach. Her ration bars were nearly gone. Water was muddy and scarce. She drank anyway. The blisters on her feet had become open wounds. Each step was fire. She tore strips of fabric from her shirt to wrap them, but it barely helped. The silence grew louder. Every thought screamed at her to stop, to lie down, to let the forest bury her and forget this madness. But the voice inside whispered back, "Still here." And she walked. On the third day, the forest spat out Stafford. She spotted him ahead, slumped against a tree, his face pale, his lips cracked. His pack lay beside him like an anchor he couldn't lift. When he looked up, his eyes were bloodshot, wild. "What are you doing here?" he rasped. "Same thing you are, trying not to die." He laughed bitterly, then coughed. "Not working for me." She considered walking past him, leaving him there to fail. It would have been easy. The program demanded it, every man for himself. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of his sneers, the humiliation he piled on her from the start. Maybe it was the faint crack in his voice when he asked, "Why are you still here?" Whatever it was, she reached down, grabbed the strap of his pack, and shoved it toward him. "Get up." He shook his head. "I can't." "You can." For a long moment, he stared at her like she was insane. Then, slowly, he forced himself to his knees. His hands shook as he dragged the pack onto his shoulders. He staggered, nearly collapsed, but he was up. Together, without a word, they walked. The days blurred. Hunger. Pain. Endless miles. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was only a word or two. Water? North. Rest. But the silence between them changed. It wasn't mockery now. It wasn't contempt. It was survival. One night, as they huddled under a half-collapsed tarp against the rain, Stafford muttered something she almost didn't hear. "You should have left me." She didn't answer. But in the dark, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him whisper the words, "Still here." By the fifth day, the forest ended. The terrain turned to hills, jagged, endless, each one steeper than the last. Every step was agony. She lost count of how many times she fell to her knees, lost count of how many times Stafford swore, shouted, threatened to quit. But every time, they rose again. Together. At one crest, Stafford collapsed flat on his back, gasping. "This is it. I'm done." She stood over him, swaying, her body on the edge of collapse too. She didn't have the energy for speeches. She just croaked, "And stay. I'm going." She turned to walk. Behind her, silence. Then a grunt. Then the sound of boots on rocks. He was still here. The final checkpoint loomed on the horizon, a tethered flag on a ridge, guarded by instructors with clipboards. By then, there were only a handful of survivors left. Most limped, some crawled. When she staggered across the line, the pack dragging her spine down, the commanding officer watched without expression. "You shouldn't have made it, but you did." She didn't answer, couldn't. She collapsed to her knees, chest heaving. Stafford crossed minutes later, barely upright, eyes glazed, but he made it. He dropped beside her, staring at the dirt, his face twisted with exhaustion. Then finally, he turned to her. "For what it's worth, you're tougher than I ever gave you credit for." She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't even look at him. She just whispered the words that had carried her this far. "Still here."
He had done it once before. In the jungle, under a leaking shelter and the iron gaze of men who loved to watch power play out, the commanding officer had pressed his authority in the worst possible way. He'd taunted her, forced her into the role of prey, and spoken the kind of words designed to strip a soldier down to shame. In that moment, she had been bound, bruised, and ordered to be small. She had closed her eyes, and the world had felt as if it might swallow her whole. Months of mud and sweat and refusal had built a different woman on that foundation. Not unbroken, but tempered. Not unafraid, but cautious. And on the night the crucible unfolded, the man from the jungle walked into the yard with the same slow, hungry smile. They had planned the exercise to finish the fractures he'd hoped to leave. Floodlights flashed. Blank gunfire cracked the quiet. Men in masks charged like phantom enemies. The recruits, exhausted and raw, were seized and dragged into corrals. Blindfolds, zip ties, rough hands tugging clothing. The whole nightmare reassembled as performance art for the instructors. He singled her out again. Dragged forward, ripped from the line, shoved into the center beneath a single blazing bulb, she tasted the salt of sleep-deprived blood at her lips and recognized the smell of that same intent. He stepped to her with the same swagger, the same cruelty dressed as authority. "Let's see what happens when the enemy breaks one of you," he said, and there was no pretense this time. His hand closed on her jaw, rough palm forcing her head up so he could look into her eyes and own whichever fear he found. This was what he had promised when he mocked her in the bus and in the pool and on the march. "You don't belong." He had been waiting for a moment no one else would stop, and he believed the crucible would hand it to him. He tried to humiliate her. He tried to force her into silence. He moved to take advantage of his control, too fast, too certain. He had done this before. He expected it to work again. She had been told in the jungle to curl up and be small. She had obeyed that first time because the instructors had cameras on the world and because she had been alone. But months of grind had steeled something inside her, a refusal that was not only stubbornness, but survival. When his hand slid toward the shape of dominance, she did not close her eyes. She met his movement with a motion that was equal parts instinct and intention. Her wrists were still sore from ropes and stress positions, her muscles not what they had been at the start, but she moved. She twisted, using the chair against his thigh. The wood stabbed into his shin. Surprise flared across his face. He barked an order. The guards surged. But she had timed it. She had trained in the dark, in the back of trucks, in the quiet hours when no one watched. She had learned how to use an enemy's weight against him. A hard shoulder into his midsection sent him off balance. He reached for a controlled response and found her elbow in his sternum before he could mount one. He staggered. The bulb above them swung and threw wild shadows across the yard. He lunged, flailing with a rage that was less strategic and more animal. She ducked, rolled, and brought both legs up against him. A trained sweep that sent him crashing into the plywood table behind him, paper and pens scattering like dead leaves. For a moment, everyone froze. He had always been the one who made the room break into shouts. He had been the judge, the hand that could punish, the man who used the drill as the stage. Now he lay on his back in a pile of his own authority, decimated by a woman he'd mocked. The guards moved to seize her. The commanding officer tried to summon them with a shout. He was furious, but his voice had no weight anymore because now the men in the cages were watching a different truth. A soldier who refused to be prey. The first sound was not from the instructors. It was Stafford. There was no mockery in his voice, only the ragged exultation of a man who had watched cruelty turned on itself. He clapped once, then again, and then the sound spread. Not applause for violence, applause for defiance. "Still here," Stafford barked, hoarse as a man who had been without sleep for days. The chant went up in pieces, one recruit, then another, then a swell until the compound trembled with the rhythm of a single word that had carried her through every test. "Still here, still here, still here." Guards hesitated. An instructor at the edge of the yard, face hard and unreadable, stared at the scene, and something like pride softened his mouth. He had been the one to design the hell they endured. He had been the one to assume she would crumble. He had been wrong. The commanding officer scrambled to his feet, face streaked with mud and fury. He reached for the radio, for backup, for anything that would reassert his control. He found hands grasping for him, his own staff, yet their faces were not the faces of loyal men. In the cages, recruits were on their feet, shouting for her. On the perimeter, another training officer, one known for his cold, surgical approach, had stopped, the clipboard in his hands lowered. He said nothing at first. Then slowly, in a voice that cut through the riot of shouts, he observed the scene and did something that transformed the moment from merely defiant to irrevocable. He clapped. It was not loud, it need not be. The sound was an instruction more than praise, recognition, a subtle, clean applause from a man who had power and was willing, finally, to place it where truth lay. The yard stopped convulsing. The guards who were about to move retreated a fraction. The commanding officer looked around, the calculus of his position breaking like ice. The training officer's recognition was worse than any reprimand. It was acceptance of the act's rightness. Stafford, shaking, toed in the dirt, and then swallowed hard. He turned, eyes wet where shame had been, and met her gaze. He did not offer a pretense. He did not apologize for the months of sneers. He simply nodded, a tiny human acknowledgement. The nod landed bigger than any speech. "You didn't deserve that," he said, quiet enough only she could hear. "You fought back.
She found her breath. She did not shout. She answered with the same small steel that had carried her this far. Still here. The rest of the night felt different. They returned the blindfold and rope to a box, not as trophies, but as proof of necessity. The commanding officer would not be stripped of rank on the spot. The military did not move that way. But in the private litany of the men who watched, the image of him being upended by someone he said didn't belong would travel far. The instructor who had clapped, who had the authority in the program, took a long, hard look at the roster. When he moved, the motion carried consequence. He ordered quiet, but his eyes met hers directly for a long, weighty second. There was respect there now, and change begins in small, visible moments. In the dark cell after, as the guards moved them back to bunks and the compound hummed with aftershocks, men whispered. The chant continued in low voices. Stafford sat on the edge of his bunk and repeated something he never believed he'd say out loud until much later. You won. She closed her eyes and let the words fold into the place where months of exhaustion had carved out the real victory. She had not simply survived the jungle's threat. She had faced its echo, and she had answered with fire. And the world that had written her off began, in tiny, stubborn ways, to write her in.
The yard looked smaller now. It wasn't the walls or the lights or the distance to the gates. Those hadn't changed. It was the lineup. The rows that once stretched into dozens now held fewer than 20 survivors, each one carved down to bone and willpower. Some had limps, some had hollow eyes. All bore bruises that told their stories. And yet, every one of them was upright, still here. The board sat beneath the canopy, officers in crisp uniforms, clipboards stacked high, pens tapping against paper. At the center was the commanding officer. His jaw was set, but his eyes didn't burn as they once had, not since the crucible. The man who had tormented her, tried to make her small, now sat silent. His authority still loomed, but his power had slipped. Everyone in the yard knew it. Another instructor sat to his left, the one who had clapped in the crucible. He watched the line not with contempt, but with something closer to pride. The whistle blew. The first name was called. A recruit stepped forward. He looked broken, arm wrapped in cloth, uniform shredded, face pale. He saluted sharply, though his hand trembled. The officers murmured, shuffled papers, exchanged nods. Selected, came the verdict. The recruit's shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in relief. He saluted again, stepped back into line, and the silence thickened. The next name, the next verdict. Selected. Then another. Selected. Each voice carried more weight than the last. The survivors began to glance at each other, realization dawning like slow sunlight. When Stafford's number was called, he marched forward with shoulders squared. There was no smirk, no sneer, just the quiet dignity of someone who had been broken down and remade. The board studied him. One officer tapped his pen. Another glanced at the notes. Then the same word rang out. Selected. Stafford turned sharply, saluted, and returned to line. But as he passed her, he paused just enough to meet her gaze. For the first time, the grin that touched his lips wasn't cruel. It was respect. Her number came last. The silence deepened to the point of suffocation. She stepped forward, boots steady despite the tremor in her legs. Her beret had not yet been placed, but the fire in her eyes carried its own weight. The board flipped through her file. Whispers passed down the line of officers, struggled in strength, exceeded in endurance, displayed leadership, defied expectation. The commanding officer leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. For a moment, his eyes locked on hers. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said again, voice low. She held his gaze, unblinking. "And yet," he added, his jaw tightening, "you are." He looked left, then right. The instructors nodded. Selected. The yard erupted. Not with cheers, not yet, but with something heavier. Survivors clapped shoulders, some wept openly, too exhausted to hide it. Stafford muttered, "About damn time," under his breath, but his eyes were wet too. It wasn't just that she had been chosen, it was that they all had. Every single one. The final officer rose. His voice was sharp, but it carried pride. "This has never happened before. You stand here as the few who refused to quit, who outlasted hunger, cold, humiliation, and doubt. Most of you should not have made it. But you did. All of you." His gaze swept across the line. It stopped on her for a fraction longer than anyone else. "You are all selected." The words struck harder than any rifle shot. When the berets were placed into their hands, silence fell again. Green cloth, light as a leaf, heavy as a mountain. Each soldier slipped it onto their head with shaking fingers. When she settled hers, it felt like iron settling into her bones, not a symbol of arrival, but of defiance turned into proof. For months, she had whispered "still here" in the mud, the swamp, the cages. Now it belonged to all of them. Stafford raised his chin. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to speak, but all he managed was a nod. Sharp, clean, the kind only one soldier gave another. It was enough. That night, in the barracks, they sat together for the first time as equals. No mockery, no rivalry, no contempt. Just a circle of survivors, nursing bruises and staring at the cloth on their head like it might disappear. One man lifted his canteen, voice cracking. "To the fallen." The rest echoed softly, "To the fallen." Then Stafford, half smiling through his swollen lip, raised his own. "And to the one who wouldn't quit." The room murmured agreement. A few tapped boots. A few whispered, "Still here." She lowered her eyes, embarrassed, but her lips curved into the smallest, proudest smile. For the first time, she wasn't just telling herself she had survived, she had shown them all what it meant. Outside, the night was clear, stars burning sharp over the compound. She stood alone in the dark, beret snug against her temple, and looked up. The voice inside her was steady, certain, the same words that had carried her across every impossible mile. Still here. This time, though, it wasn't whispered in defiance. It was spoken in victory.
The base was quiet at dawn. No shouting, no whistles, no boots pounding mud. Only the wind sliding through chain-link fences, carrying with it the smell of dust and distant pine. For the first time in months, she woke not to an order, but to silence. Her body, still a map of bruises and cuts, finally rested without fear of a siren. She dressed slowly, running a hand over the beret folded neatly at her bedside. The green cloth looked ordinary, but she knew it was everything. The ceremony was short. No parades, no speeches for television, just a hall filled with officers, instructors, and the survivors who had endured the same gauntlet. They stood together in fresh uniforms, lines sharper now, scars hidden beneath pressed fabric. But nothing could hide what they had become. When her name was called, she walked to the front. The commanding officer, the same man who had tried to break her in the jungle, the crucible, every step of the way, handed her the beret personally. For the first time, his eyes didn't burn with contempt.
They carried something heavier: respect. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said softly. "But now you'll always be remembered as the one who was." She saluted, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Because this moment wasn't his to give her, it was hers to take. Word spread fast. Whispers carried beyond the compound, through units and camps, through barracks and training yards. A woman had made it. A woman had endured. The debates began in conference rooms far above her pay grade. Some generals dismissed it as an anomaly. Others saw it as proof. But even those who tried to diminish it couldn't erase the truth. She had faced every trial the same as the men. The mud, the swamp, the miles, the cages. And she had not only survived, she had fought back. Inside the barracks, the shift was subtler. The laughter that once mocked her was gone. In its place was camaraderie, a bond not of pity, but of fire, shared in the same furnace. Recruits nodded to her in the halls. Instructors held their critiques a fraction longer, then turned away with grudging pride. And Stafford, the man who had once laughed loudest, walked with her across the yard one afternoon, silent for a long time, before finally speaking. "I used to bet you wouldn't last a week." She smirked faintly. "You lost that bet." He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I think I won. Because you proved to me what toughness really looks like." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The nod they exchanged was enough. Her story didn't stay inside the compound. At training camps across the country, instructors told her story to new recruits. They whispered of the woman who had endured drown-proofing, the march, the long walk, the crucible, and who had fought back when no one expected her to. Cadets repeated her mantra under their breath when their muscles gave out. "Still here." And one by one, walls that had stood for generations began to crack. Years later, when asked about her legacy, she would always answer the same way. "I wasn't the strongest, I wasn't the fastest, I wasn't the best at anything." She would pause, her green eyes steady. "But I was the only one who refused to quit." That, she knew, was what selection really tested. Not brawn, not brilliance, but defiance. The will to whisper, "Still here," when the world screamed, "Give up." On her final night at the base, she stood outside alone, the beret snug against her temple, the stars sharp above her. She closed her eyes and heard it all again. The chants in the cages, the roar of men pounding fists, the whisper of her own voice carrying her through mud and fire. When she opened her eyes, she spoke the words one last time, not in defiance now, but in triumph. "Still here." And that's the story of the soldier who wasn't supposed to make it, but did. She fought through doubt, humiliation, and pain. She proved everyone wrong, and in doing so, she didn't just change her life, she changed the course of history. If this story inspired you, do me a favor, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next tale of grit, survival, and unstoppable willpower. Because remember, the world will try to break you, but you can always answer back with two simple words: "Still here."